MGM was in serious trouble in 1958. The studio had spent $15 million on a biblical epic so enormous it required the largest film set ever built, 18 acres of Roman arena, 2,500 horses, and a lead role that every major star in Hollywood had refused. Burt Lancaster called the script boring. Paul Newman said he didn't have the legs for a tunic. Kirk Douglas wanted it and got turned down. So the studio turned to a man who'd grown up almost entirely alone in the Michigan wilderness, performing scenes from books to an audience of pine trees. A man whose wife had turned down his marriage proposals multiple times before eventually saying yes. A man who'd driven elevators and posed for art students just to afford a cold water apartment with no heat. His name was Charlton Heston, and almost nobody believed a backwoods kid from a one-room schoolhouse in northern Michigan was about to become the greatest epic film star who ever lived. Here are 10 moments that prove them all wrong. Number 10. The Boy Who Talked to Trees. On the 4th of October, 1923, a boy named John Charles Carter was born in a small strip of land between Evanston and Wilmette, Illinois. His father, Russell, ran a lumber mill. His grandfather had founded a magazine called Carter's Weekly, which was later sold and became Red Book, the women's monthly still in print today. The family relocated early on to St. Helens, Michigan, a remote forested town in Roscommon County. There, the boy disappeared into the wilderness. He attended a one-room schoolhouse, hunted deer with his father for food rather than sport, fished, and chopped kindling. Then, when the work was done, he walked into the woods alone and started acting. Hour after hour, day after day, this solitary boy in the Michigan backwoods performed Shakespeare and adventure stories to birch trees and white-tailed deer. He later wrote that his first real memory was digging in the sandy Michigan earth with a red toy shovel, but his truest memory was pretending. Standing alone in those silent woods, something clicked. He said, "I realized that my youthful game of pretend was actually something adults did too on stage." Number 9. The Wound That Never Healed. When John Charles was 10 years old, his world fell apart. His parents divorced. Decades after the war, after the Oscar, after parting the Red Sea on screen, Charlton Heston said with complete certainty that his parents' divorce was, in his own words, the most traumatic experience of my life, including World War II. Let that sink in. A man who flew combat missions as a radio operator and aerial gunner on B-25 Mitchell bombers said nothing in the war came close to the day his family fell apart. His mother, Lilla, remarried a man named Chester Heston, and the family relocated to Wilmette, Illinois. The children took their stepfather's surname, and just like that, John Charles Carter became Charlton Heston. A quiet, awkward kid who'd swapped the Michigan wilderness for a crowded suburban school where he knew nobody, but New Trier High School had something the woods didn't. It had a drama program. The moment Heston stepped onto that stage, everything shifted. A young filmmaker named David Bradley cast him in an amateur silent 16mm adaptation of Henrik Ibsen's Peer Gynt in 1941, the first time Heston ever appeared on film. His talent earned him a drama scholarship to Northwestern University, where he studied classical literature and stagecraft. It was there he met a drama student named Lydia Marie Clark. He was smitten instantly. She wasn't. He proposed. She said no. He proposed again. She said no again. For 2 full years, she turned him down every time. Then the war arrived. Heston enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces, trained as a radio operator and aerial gunner on B-25S. Before he shipped out, he wrote to Lydia one last time. Something shifted. She said, yes. They married in a North Carolina church in March of 1944. That marriage lasted 64 years, right up until the day he died, one of the longest in Hollywood history, and it started with a woman who kept saying no. They had a dream, and they were determined to chase it. So they packed up everything and moved to New York City, renting a freezing walk-up in Hell's Kitchen with no hot water and a radiator that barely kept them alive. Money disappeared fast. Heston posed for art students, letting them sketch him for a few dollars an hour. He ran elevators. Lydia grabbed whatever work she could find. Every night, he auditioned for anything on offer. Broadway was flooded with veterans chasing the same dream, and the competition was ruthless. Rejection piled on rejection. There was one night, early on, when both of them stood in that cold apartment, broke and worn down, and Heston had to decide whether any of this was worth it. He stayed. In 1947, he landed a small part in a Broadway production of Antony and Cleopatra. It wasn't a starring role, but when the show toured nationally, casting directors across the country started taking notice. Live television followed, with roles on Studio One and Suspense, where millions of Americans saw his face for the first time. One of those Americans was Hal Wallace, the legendary producer behind Casablanca. He watched Heston on a small black and white screen and saw something nobody else had caught. He offered Heston a film contract, and in 1950, Charlton Heston made his Hollywood debut in the noir thriller Dark City, playing a gambler running from gangsters. He was 30 years old, had been acting for nearly a decade, and was still largely unknown. That was about to change. In 1952, Cecil B. DeMille cast Heston in The Greatest Show on Earth, a Technicolor circus drama that won the Academy Award for Best Picture. It was a hit, but DeMille was already thinking bigger. He was remaking his own 1923 silent film, The Ten Commandments, as a massive VistaVision epic filmed in Egypt with 14,000 extras and 15,000 animals. He needed a Moses. He considered William Boyd, better known as Hopalong Cassidy, but Boyd turned it down. So DeMille held up a photograph of Michelangelo's marble statue of Moses, the one in the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome, looked at Charlton Heston and said, "That is the face of Moses." Heston was cast, and he attacked the role with a focus that left the entire production speechless. He didn't just play Moses, he became him. Heston personally asked DeMille to let him voice God in the burning bush scene, and DeMille said yes. His own infant son, Fraser, was cast as the baby Moses floating in the basket on the Nile. Then, mid-production, the 75-year-old DeMille suffered a massive heart attack after climbing 130 feet up to inspect a faulty camera. He took 2 days off, ignored his doctor's orders, and came back to finish the film. The Ten Commandments opened on the 8th of November 1956, and it was a sensation. It cost over $13 million and pulled in $90 million at the box office. Heston went from working actor to international star almost overnight, and even that was just the beginning. When William Wyler started casting Ben-Hur in 1957, Heston wasn't even on his radar. Lancaster passed, Newman passed, Douglas was turned away. Only after every major name in Hollywood had said no did Wyler finally come to Heston. He was formally cast on the 22nd of January 1958 for a salary of $250,000. The chariot race was always going to be the heart of the film. Yakima Canutt, the greatest stuntman Hollywood had ever produced, was brought in to coordinate the sequence and spent months training Heston to drive a 4-horse team at full gallop. The horses, mostly Lipizzaner stallions imported from Yugoslavia, were trained for up to 6 months before they ever hit the track together. The arena, built at Cinecittà Studios in Rome, covered 18 acres, making it the largest single film set ever constructed. When the day finally came, Heston was terrified. He pulled Canutt aside and said, "All the time, it has just been you and me and this one team, several hours a day. When we do this sequence, there will be 8 other teams out there. That is not so easy." Canutt looked at him and gave him 5 words that became legendary. "Chuck, you just stay in the chariot." They filmed the race over 5 weeks. The finished sequence runs just over 9 minutes, shot without a single digital effect or green screen. The crashes were real. The danger was real. Stuntman Joe Canutt Yakima's own son, was thrown from his chariot during filming, and Wyler thought the footage was so spectacular he kept it in the final cut. 4,000 extras filled the stands, and nobody had to tell them to cheer. They screamed like the race was actually happening. On the 4th of April 1960, Ben-Hur swept the Academy Awards with 11 wins, a record that held for nearly 40 years. Charlton Heston took home Best Actor. A reporter asked him backstage which scene he'd loved most, and Heston didn't hesitate. "I did not enjoy any of it. It was hard work." He turned to director William Wyler and said, "I guess this is old hat to you." Wyler, a 3-time Oscar winner himself, smiled and replied, "Chuck, it never gets old hat." Number 4. The Man Who Marched Before It Was Fashionable. By the early 1960s, Heston was one of the biggest names in Hollywood. He could have kept his head down, stayed quiet, protected everything he'd built. He didn't. In May of 1961, he traveled to Oklahoma City and personally picketed a segregated lunch counter. Not exactly a safe move for a white leading man in 1961, but he didn't seem to care. Then, on the 28th of August, 1963, he boarded a chartered plane alongside Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Marlon Brando, Paul Newman, and Burt Lancaster, flying to Washington for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. As president of the Screen Actors Guild, Heston led the Hollywood delegation. Before they left Los Angeles, Brando held up a cattle prod used against demonstrators in Alabama and pushed for them to chain themselves to the Lincoln Memorial. Heston refused, saying they should play by the rules. Brando backed down. They did it Chuck's way. That afternoon, Heston stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and watched Martin Luther King Jr. deliver the most famous speech in American history. When asked later why he'd marched, Heston said, "Up until very recently, like most Americans, I expressed my support of civil rights, largely by talking about it at cocktail parties. But like many Americans this summer, I could no longer pay only lip service to a cause that was so urgently right and in a time that is so urgently now." After his death in 2008, scholar Earl O'Farry Hutchinson said, "He supported the rights of racial minorities before it was fashionable in Hollywood, and we honor him for his monumental contributions to the civil rights movement." Number 3. You Maniacs. In 1968, producer Arthur P. Jacobs came to Heston with a strange offer: a science fiction film about an astronaut who crash lands on a planet ruled by talking apes. The concept seemed almost too strange to work. No studio wanted anything to do with it, but Heston saw what everyone else had missed. As he put it, "I liked the idea of the talking monkeys and a different civilization." The screenplay came from Rod Serling, the creator of The Twilight Zone. And Serling had done something the original French novel never attempted. He'd added a twist ending. Even so, the studio wouldn't commit a single dollar until they had proof. Could audiences actually watch actors in full ape prosthetics without laughing? A makeup test was shot. Heston and 2 other actors ran a dramatic scene in complete ape faces, and the executives watched in silence. Nobody laughed. The film got the green light. Filming pushed everyone to the edge. The desert locations across California, Utah, and Arizona baked in temperatures past 100 degrees, and the ape cast spent 3 to 4 hours each morning having foam latex glued to their faces. Heston later called it the most physically punishing role of his career. He was whipped, soaked with a fire hose, caged, stripped, and dragged through dirt. And there's one detail that shows just how total the illusion really was. His co-star, Kim Hunter, played the chimpanzee scientist Zira throughout the entire shoot, and when Heston finally saw her without makeup, he didn't recognize her at all. He'd spent months acting opposite a woman whose actual face he'd never once seen. The film's real punch came in its final moments. The ending was kept completely secret, and audiences had no idea what was heading their way. Heston's astronaut George Taylor rides along a desolate beach and then stops cold. Rising from the sand are the shattered remains of the Statue of Liberty. Taylor drops to his knees, and Heston delivered what became one of the most iconic lines in cinema history. "You maniacs. You blew it up. Oh, damn you. God damn you all to hell." The art director later admitted he'd sketched that entire final storyboard on the back of a bar napkin. Planet of the Apes became one of the highest-grossing films of 1968 and launched a franchise that's still running today. Number 2. From My Cold, Dead Hands. In the years that followed, Charlton Heston went through one of the most striking political transformations in American public life. The man who had marched alongside Martin Luther King, picketed segregated lunch counters, and campaigned for Adlai Stevenson in 1956, and John F. By 1960, Heston had become one of the loudest conservative voices in the country. He switched parties in 1987, and when people asked why, his answer was blunt. He hadn't changed. The culture had. In 1998, he was elected president of the National Rifle Association. Then, on the 20th of May 2000, at the NRA's annual convention in Charlotte, North Carolina, he delivered the moment that would follow him forever. Speaking against Al Gore's gun control platform, he reached behind the podium, lifted a replica colonial musket above his head with both hands, and in that voice that had commanded pharaohs, he declared, "From my cold, dead hands." The phrase had existed before him, printed on NRA bumper stickers years earlier, but Heston made it legendary. Millions cheered it, millions condemned it. It made him the most divisive figure in American public life. 2 years later, filmmaker Michael Moore turned up at his front door with a camera crew for Bowling for Columbine. The encounter was hard to watch. Heston, already showing signs of cognitive decline, struggled under Moore's aggressive line of questioning and eventually stood up and walked away. For a man who had never backed down from anything, it was a painful thing to witness. In August of 2002, Charlton Heston sat down in front of a camera and recorded a message to the world. He was 78 years old. That voice, the one that had spoken the words of Moses, was quieter now, slower. He told everyone he'd been diagnosed with symptoms consistent with Alzheimer's disease. It was a cruel end for a man who had built his entire life around words. The disease took his memory, his speech, his ability to recognize the people closest to him. But one thing never changed through any of it. Lydia was there. The woman who had turned down his proposals at Northwestern, who had finally said yes before he shipped off to war, who had walked those freezing streets with him in Hell's Kitchen when they had nothing. She never left his side. Not once. Their marriage lasted 64 years. Through the fame and the fury, the Oscars and the protest lines, both of them surviving cancer, Charlton and Lydia Heston stayed together through all of it. Both of them fought back against everything life threw at them. But when the one enemy arrived that no amount of willpower could stop, Lydia fought it for him. On the 5th of April 2008, Charlton Heston passed away at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 84 years old. President George W. Bush, who had presented him with the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2003, called him an extraordinary American. But the most honest tribute came from Heston himself. Years before, in a moment of quiet reflection, he'd written this: "Where else but in America could a lanky country kid named Charlton sprout in the anonymity of the Michigan Northwoods and forge a life that makes a difference?" He started life as John Charles Carter on a forgotten strip of Illinois farmland. He grew up talking to trees in the Michigan wilderness, survived his parents' divorce, and chased a woman who kept turning him down. He ran elevators and posed for art classes just to afford food. And then he became Moses. He became Ben-Hur. He stood beside Martin Luther King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. He screamed at the ruins of the Statue of Liberty. He raised a musket above his head and dared the world to take it. And when the one enemy came that even he couldn't beat, he faced it the only way he knew how: upright, eyes forward, refusing to flinch. That was Charlton Heston. There will never be another one quite like him. If this story moved you, subscribe the channel and never miss another one. See you in the next one.